Comrades, this is an extremely important discussion, I think, because the question of Cuba continues to be an issue that preoccupies many young people in particular. Every time we go to university freshers' fairs, we come across people wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. Now that doesn't signify that they all understand what Che Guevara stood for. It is, of course, for many people, a fashion statement. But the ideas of Che Guevara in particular, and more broadly the Cuban Revolution, continue for many people to be a beacon, an antidote to the poison that they see coming from the capitalist world around them. And what we need to do in this session especially is look at the forces that led up to the Cuban Revolution, the strengths of that revolutionary movement in terms of the objectives that were realized in economic facts and figures, but also the weaknesses of that movement. But no one can fail to be affected by the broad sweep of what happened in Cuba in 1959 and thereafter. And I just want to quote from one of the most famous documents of that period, the famous Second Declaration of Havana, which was a speech by Fidel in 1962, and which in parts reveals very clearly the weaknesses in the thinking of Fidel and the leadership of what was to become the Cuban Communist Party, but also fascinates and excites the masses with the language that is used to denounce imperialism. And it's very different really from language you would hear today. And just a small quote from this speech from Fidel. Cuba represents the people. The United States represents the monopolies. Cuba speaks for America's exploited masses. The US for the exploiting oligarchical and imperialist interests. Cuba for sovereignty. The US for intervention. Cuba for the nationalization of foreign enterprises. The US for new investments of foreign capital. Cuba for culture. The US for ignorance. Cuba for agrarian reform. The US for great landed estates. Cuba for the industrialization of America. The US for underdevelopment. Cuba for creative work. The US for sabotage and counter-revolutionary terror practiced by its agents, the destruction of sugarcane fields and factories, the bombing by their pirate planes of the labor of a peaceful people. Cuba for the murdered teachers, the US for the assassins. Cuba for bread, the US for hunger. Cuba for equality, the US for privilege and discrimination, and so on. Now that would have been a powerful speech made in a meeting of this audience, but it was a meeting attended by millions in Cuba. Millions heard those words. Millions were fired by the idea that Cuba was being built afresh, that the gangster regime that had existed prior to the revolutionary overthrow in 1959 was being consigned to history and was being replaced by a new Cuba, a Cuba that would provide dignity to the people, would provide jobs for the people, would sort out once and for all the sores of illiteracy, of poverty, and so on. And so it's not surprising that even today, words like that resonate within the labour movement and attract and inspire young people with the idea that Cuba represents something very different. If we add to those words the heroic struggle, particularly of Che Guevara, and the comments of Che and the heroism, the personal heroism of Che and the Cuban revolutionaries, then we have a package before us which in summary indicates that something very special happened in Cuba in 1959 and still resonates today across the world, but particularly in Latin America, where even despite the most perfidious role played by imperialism, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the Cuban flag still flies. The Cuban Revolution still survives. And it's our job as Marxists to separate out what is positive in that process from what is negative, what is in many ways a break with the traditional idea that Marxism had prior to the revolution about how a revolution would unfold. And why, therefore, did the revolution unfold in this particular manner? Tony will deal this afternoon with the question of perspectives for Cuba, and therefore I will not touch upon that question itself, but I think many comrades who've read our material and who are familiar with the regime that existed prior to the 1959 overthrow will be well aware that the Batista regime summarized everything that was rotten about the development in Central and Latin America. The dictatorships that embellished that continent were summarized never more clearly than by the horrendous regime which existed in pre-revolutionary Cuba. Batista, the gangster, had turned the Cuban society into a playground for the rich. There were more Cadillacs in Cuba than in any other city in the world. And it was a playground for American imperialism. Even a very biased witness who was, the then president, or shortly to become the president of the US, John Kennedy, who of course had no interest in seeing a genuine revolutionary state emerge in Cuba, commented in 1963 that I believe there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. Fewer children went to school at the end of the 1950s in Cuba than had been educated in the 1920s. 114 farms, constituting less than 0.1% of the total number of farms in Cuba, encompassed over 20% of arable land in Cuba itself. And the economy, as was the case with so many other economies under the domination of bourgeois imperialism, was forced to really change its economy and embrace monoculture, that is to say, become dependent utterly on the export of sugar, as sugar which was taken by the United States. And so you had in Cuba a really very backward regime which was not capable of taking the masses forward. Now, the Cuban Revolution certainly demonstrates the potential gains, the social and economic gains that can be made by economic planning. We could have done with a bit of economic planning this morning when we travelled over on the trains. But of course, to be serious, economic planning, of course, is superior to the blind force of the market. The Cuban Revolution demonstrated in economic facts and figures, as the Russian Revolution demonstrated in 1917, the Chinese Revolution, and all other revolutions, that the planned economy can take humankind forward, can begin for the first time in human history to make sense of the so-called blind forces of the market, can rationally plan on the basis of people's needs, on the basis of what is necessary in society, rather than what is immediately profitable for the minority who control society under this system. So, for instance, the Cuban Revolution between 1959 and 1965 saw industrial production leap by 50%. By 1961, Castro was making the claim, and it's a claim that holds substance, that illiteracy had all been wiped out. Within a year or so, the educational programs were in place to begin a literacy program that was to sweep across the island. The infant mortality rate by 1975 was the lowest in the whole of Latin America. And by 1973, and obviously these statistics refer to the period before the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, but by 1973, the American bourgeois themselves, in a confidential document, were forced to accept that per capita income in Cuba, that is, the income per head, was higher than in any Latin or Caribbean country than Venezuela itself. Of course, they admitted that through gritted teeth. Later, the collapse of Stalinism was to have a devastating effect on the Cuban economy. So, for instance, between 1990 and 1993, GDP, gross domestic product, fell by over 1/3. We'll look at the consequences of that in more depth this afternoon, but for now, I want to stress the gains that were made economically by the overthrow of the Batista regime itself. But of course, this introduction would be failing in its task if it were merely limited to a chronological explanation of what happened. We need to know what happened. There are plenty of books, actually, on Wikipedia and many other sources that tell us what happened. But what we have to do uniquely, our responsibility, is to examine the motor forces of that revolution, to pose the question of whether the Cuban Revolution unfolded in a classical Marxist manner, or whether that revolution deviated from the forms that Marx, and particularly Lenin and Trotsky, would have been familiar with and understood and fought for. And if so, why those developments occurred and how those developments could occur in the teeth of imperialism's anger and aiming at overthrowing the Cuban regime itself.